Buddhism is everywhere and nowhere. I meet people all the time who say things like, yeah, I'm really into Buddhism, but they seem to have no idea what the Buddha actually taught. This episode's going to get our toes in the water, or as he might have said, get the wheel rolling. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. Allow me to introduce another of my friends, Siddhartha Gautama, more popularly known as simply the Buddha. For those of you who might be new to the podcast, I'm having conversations with a number of my friends, people like Moses and Krishna, Lao Tzu, and Muhammad. Because my friends are not exactly available for live interviews, I'm relying on various texts in order to hear their voices. I began with Jesus, or rather with the Gospel of John, or rather with just the first 18 verses of John, and how that presented things about Jesus. And now I'm spending time with the Buddha. My plan, such as it is to begin with the beginnings of each friend, or more accurately, the beginnings of the texts I'm relying on, and then at various points to bring two or more of them together for a group conversation, as it were. One thing I've noticed about these friends, 6 in total, is that they represent 2 major rivers within the spiritual heritages of humanity, what are conveniently, but not really correctly, referred to as the East and the West. So, for example, the so-called Western heritages, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the so-called Eastern heritages, in my case, what's popularly known as Hinduism, Buddhism in its different expressions, and Taoism. I took Jesus first because of how much time I've spent with the Gospels. Now the Buddha is next because in spite of the fact that my deeper friendship with the Buddha is more recent than some of the others, he's become the second most influential figure among my sacred friends. That influence includes the way that the Buddha's more philosophical insights force me to ask new questions and to revisit assumptions I make about the world, and especially, as we will see later, the nature of the self. But even more importantly, in my daily life, I've been increasingly influenced and shaped in my personal practices of meditation by Buddha's approaches to mindfulness and to compassion and empathy. The Buddha's teaching has brought me to the place where I sometimes refer to myself as a Jesus follower and a Buddha meditator. I plan to explain that at some point, but not right now. For now, on to the Buddha himself. And one challenge in making friends with the Buddha is knowing where to find him. Not because there isn't material out there, but the opposite. There is so much material that it's hard to know where to start. The collections of his teachings are most commonly called Tripitaka, or the 3 baskets, though some Buddhists think there might be more than 3 of these baskets. Each basket is like a container, if you will, for a type of material. Philosophical teachings in a basket, for example, texts intended to guide the Buddhist monastic communities in another basket. The lines between these divisions are not as hard and clear as it sounds, and material can contain a mix of things, of course. At the center of it all, the main basket, in my view, is the Buddha's own teaching. These discourses, or suttas, are the heart of all that the baskets contain. So I'm going to begin with the beginning of his teaching, which is the first sutta he is said to have delivered. It's the discourse called the Dhammacakkappavatana Sutta, or dhumma-chak-ka-pawat-tana Sutta, or in English, Setting the Wheel of Dhamma in Motion Sutta. Dhamma meaning teaching here. It's aptly named. The sutta is like the first turning of a wheel, that sets the ongoing role of that wheel in motion because it provides an overview of the entire path, which we know as Buddhism, and invites people to follow it. It's called the middle way. It also refers to the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. In combination, that is a distillation of everything else that the Buddha taught. Or, better put, everything else the Buddha taught is an interpretation, application, and explanation of the middle way, the Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Path. So, setting in motion the wheel of Dhamma. There are a number of translations available of this, and at times I'm going to mention alternative ways that they each treat various words and ideas, but it helps to have one base translation as a starting point. There's information about the one that I'm using in the episode description if you're interested to find out more, along with some resources for exploring all that further on your own. Okay, here we go. And as I did with John, I'll be going section by section, phrase by phrase, often word by word through this sutta, which, by almost universal affirmation among Buddhists, is the first discourse, the first teaching that he gave for those who became followers in what is now known as Buddhism. And here's how it begins. And it begins not with his words, but the words of a narrator. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana. There the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5 thusly, ... Let me take it phrase by phrase, term by term. On one occasion. Well, when was this? This occasion took place around 520 to 530 BCE, in terms of before the Common Era, when the Buddha was approximately 35 years of age. And by the way, that century, the 6th century before the Common Era, falls right in the middle of what a man named Karl Jaspers referred to as the axial age, a period in human history that can be described as an axis, a pivot point, between the 8th and 3rd century of the BCE, and that is a long period of time in which this period falls right in the middle. In Persia, India, China, and the area of what is now Israel and Palestine and Lebanon, this was the age of the Buddha, Lao Tzu, Plato, Socrates, and Jeremiah, just to name a few. One feature spread all over that vast geographic and conceptual range that we just covered. One feature of the axial age was the emergence of new philosophical and religious systems in widely varied places and contexts and cultures, which in various ways included a paradoxical shift towards, on the one hand, larger, transcendent, universal ways of thinking, things that were less localized and we might even say tribalized, while on the other hand, also being an age in which there was a new appreciation of the individual and of reflective thinking by individuals. And the Buddha's approach, as we'll see, is an example of this paradoxical development. His teaching emerged from his direct insights as an individual, we might say, through his own individual, personal, reflective thinking and meditation alone on his own. And he taught others to do the same as individuals. At the same time, his entire system included insights, sometimes fully developed in his own thinking, sometimes left as seeds that later Buddhist schools developed more fully into, for want of a better term, was an all-encompassing way of seeing the universal nature of everything. So, on one occasion is in that period of time. But on that one occasion, we're told the Blessed One, ... said something or did something. Blessed One is English for a term in both Sanskrit and Pali, Bhagava or Bhagavan. It's the same term used in the title, for example, of the Bhagavad Gita, so it may sound familiar, which is translated into English as the Song of the Lord. It's a common way to refer to the Buddha when referring to him in the third person, the Blessed One or the Bhagavan. Often translated as Lord, it literally means one who possesses good fortune. Ironic, given that worldly fortune is what the Buddha walked away from. It's appropriate, however, metaphorically as referring to the good fortune of the enlightenment he received, even though literally it refers to a good fortune in monetary terms or resource terms. Then it goes on to say, on one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana. Let me take these. This is trying to zero in sort of a map quest identification of where he was. Varanasi, a city, also known today as Benares. It's one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, from as far back as the 11th century of before the Common Era. It's located in what is now the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh along the Ganges River adjacent to Nepal. It's a sacred pilgrimage site, home to more than 2,000 temples. Dying in Varanasi is believed to lead to liberation. So as a result, as you can see, as you might guess, there's many who would say that Varanasi is the spiritual heart of India. Now, in Varanasi, the city, in the deer park. This is both a name and a description. Legend has it that during a certain king's hunting trip, he took aim at a female deer, and a male deer leapt in and offered to sacrifice itself to save her life. This deeply impressed the king, and he declared that this park would be designated as a sanctuary for deer from thenceforth. Some Buddhist legends suggest that that male deer was in fact the Buddha in a prior life. So it has special significance. It's set apart. It's a place where there was a sacrificial giving. But it's not just in Varanasi at the deer park, it's also at something called Isipatana. The text reads as if the deer park and Isipatana are different, as if the deer park is located in a place called Isipatana, for example, maybe as a district or a portion of Varanasi. However, it's really two ways of referring to the same place. Isipatana is a Pali word that can be translated the place where holy people descended. So, let's put all this together. Varanasi, the deer park, Isipatana. The opening of this sutta sets the location of the first teaching event in a very specific context, rich in meaning and associations for those who know the stories and the events. It's not just some place. It's not just anywhere. This happens in a very special somewhere. In fact, so special that later the Buddha would tell his followers that this location is one of 4 Buddhist pilgrimage sites that his devout followers should visit and revere. The other 3 are Lumbini, the birthplace of the Buddha, Bodh Gaya, where Buddha achieved enlightenment, and Kushinagar, where the Buddha attained what is called parinirvana, or final nirvana, the state which occurs at the death of someone who has already attained enlightenment during their life. So, that opening statement, on one occasion the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana, says a lot about the time and place where the Buddha began to turn the wheel of his teaching in public, growing eventually into the movement we know today as Buddhism. Now it goes on to say there, in that special location, the Buddha, or the Blessed One, I should say, addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5. Now, of course, for something to be public means that there are others. There's a public. And in this case, it's 5 others, a small public, but still public, referred to here as bhikkhus. The word bhikkhu means literally beggar, though in this context it's referring to a particular type of begging, one who lives by receiving alms, as Buddhist monks do. The 5 bhikkhus mentioned here were the first 5 disciples or followers or monks of the Buddhist community. These 5 had together initially practiced extreme asceticism, and they did so with the Buddha before he was the Buddha. They were all 6, seeking the same end, enlightenment. However, these 5 had all rejected their fellow seeker when he embraced what he later referred to as the middle way, the path which he claimed had led to his awakening. The 5 didn't accept this claim initially, and instead, because part of his middle way involved a middle way between extreme self-denial and, of course, extreme self-gratification. At first, the five didn't accept the claim that he had found enlightenment through this middle way. They thought he had just grown lax and lazy, lost focus, lost commitment, and left the path. One of them, however, began to sense that there was something different in their friend, and this eventually led to all five embracing his message, the message contained in the very discourse we're about to look at. As a result of embracing the teaching in this sutta, the five friends also then, we're told, experienced enlightenment. And so the Buddha and his first five followers, as a result, became the beginning of what's called the Sangha, the community of Buddhist monks. The match that lit the flame, that set everything in motion, was this sutta. It's this teaching and everything in it that began to roll the wheel. This is the event which caused it all. But this event is more than just the teaching. What gets the wheel rolling is the combination of the teaching, its reception by these five bhikkhus, the enlightenment they then experienced as a result, and the formation of the first monastic community. It's all of these things in combination, really, which set the wheel in motion. All of the material in the sutta so far has been introductory, and it's been given in the third person. But now we're at the point where the Buddha himself begins to speak. And here are his first words. Bhikkhus, he says, addressing his friends, these two extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What two things? One, the pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble and unbeneficial. And two, the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. Now, I'm going to begin phrase by phrase with the phrase, one who has gone forth into homelessness. This is important in understanding what the Buddha is inviting his listeners towards, whether centuries ago or now, you and I. There are two ways to understand the phrase, literally and metaphorically. Literally, this refers to those who become monks and as such leave behind what's called the householder life, with all of its responsibilities and, from the point of view of those seeking liberation, all of its distractions. More specifically, the background to this is the Buddha's own literal going forth, and there's different versions of the story that's behind that, the essence of which is this. The man who came to be known as the Buddha was raised in wealth and comfort, in what today we would call privilege. His father wanted to shield him from the outside world, and in part, to distract him, made sure that he surrounded his son with every sort of pastime, every form of sensual pleasure and distraction, including, when he got old enough, the company of beautiful women, and we can read between the lines as to what that likely meant. The story tells us, in spite of these efforts to shield the Buddha from the outside world, one day he left the palace. He went forth, literally. And when he did, he saw an old man, a sick person, a corpse, and a contented monk. Rather than simply seeing these four sights and ignoring them, or living in denial, this experience had a profound effect. To put it succinctly, the Buddha was gripped by the reality of his own inevitable future, that he too would age, likely experience debilitating weakness and illness. He too would become a corpse. His body would decompose and rot in the ground. And at the same time, in the monk, he saw the possibility of another path. The mention of a monk is a good place to make note of something very briefly here. The Buddha's quest and his unique answers to the questions he pursued took place within the incredibly diverse, multiform, complex world of what would later become popularly but improperly referred to as Hinduism. In fact, the religious and philosophical universe of the subcontinent, what is now Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh especially, was itself a cosmos of ideas, approaches, worldviews, ways of thinking, and practices that are so varied as to defy definition. They're not one brand. They certainly don't fit neatly under an umbrella of a single term like Hinduism. It's in that context, though, that the Buddha's quest took him from one teacher and one school of thought, one approach to another. But he found that each failed in enabling him to arrive at the destination he was seeking. There are suttas which provide more detail about that journey and the different schools of thought that he encountered along the way. I'm not going to pause here longer than simply to note that the Buddha's way of describing the path did not emerge in a void, out of nowhere, out of nothing. His unique and different set of answers emerged within that broader religious and philosophical world of his time, a time of ideas and practices. The monk mentioned here as the fourth of the four sights is like a symbol for that whole world. These four sights became the impetus for Buddha's search and led ultimately to his awakening. To begin that journey, he walked out of his home and went forth into the homeless, houseless life, as had the 5 other bhikkhus. So going forth from the housed life was a literal thing. But we can also read it metaphorically. These events in Buddha's life also imply that the quest requires us to leave behind not just a physical house, but our assumptions, preconceived and contextually constructed ideas, which produce the illusion of truth and certainty, including, as we'll come to see, the illusion that there is, inside of all this, a distinct, independent, individual self, quote unquote, that is holding on to the various assumptions that we will need to leave behind, because they are the sources of the delusion of a false sense of security in the permanence of the world and the ways we see it, and of ourselves as the ones doing the seeing. Going forth leaves all that behind, but in order to find what does the Buddha say we should be searching for? And what's the path that leads to whatever that is? The sutta includes the Buddha's answer to all of those questions. So, he first begins to answer that by talking about the middle way. And here are his words again. Bhikkhus, these two extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. So it's a middle way between two extremes. The mention of two extremes to be avoided is an introduction to a central theme in the Buddhist teaching, the middle way. A middle way between what? And there are several answers to that. The first answer is that it's the path that leads between the two extremes described just now. 1, the pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial. And 2, the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. These words contain the insight of the Buddha about a widespread assumption of the time, that enlightenment and awakening and truth would result only from avoiding all forms of sensual pleasure by going to the opposite extreme, practicing severe physical, bodily asceticism. So fully had the Buddha himself pursued that path that at one point he had restricted himself to eating 3 grains of rice per day. But the Buddha had discovered that a balance was necessary. He came to the conclusion that the pursuit of enlightenment required both psychic and physical energy, and thus that the one seeking enlightenment must keep their body healthy enough for that journey. But there's more within this brief statement about the two extremes than likely meets our eyes. To unpack it further, I'm going to focus on what I think are the 3 most important words and concepts in the phrase. The pursuit of, and the word pursuit, the word sensual needs to get some explanation, and the word beneficial. Let's talk about pursuit first. The pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, and second, the pursuit of self-mortification. The word pursuit is translated addiction by one of the versions of this sutta that I was comparing, by Piyadasi Thera. Others use the word devoted. The Buddha is addressing the fact that we get attached to and continue to repeat certain patterns and habits by which we're attempting to get what we want from life, even if they don't work. Well, what is it that we want from life? On the one hand, the Buddha notes the extreme of seeking what this translation I just referred to renders as sensual happiness in sensual pleasures. The phrase may suggest to us the experiences of various physical pleasures. Specifically today, we likely would associate the term sensual with sexual. But we should take the word much more literally in terms of its root connections to the word sense, and thus to our senses. The senses the Buddha refers to are the five we normally think of: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, and one more, 6 senses. In the Buddha's teaching, in addition to those 5, or the 5 organs of them, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the body, there is another sensor and another sense. The sensor is the mind. The mind, like the other instruments in the list, is dependent on what it touches, or what touches it, what it experiences, what it encounters. Our thoughts and perceptions and concepts and formulations and ideas and imaginations and memories are all conditioned by other stimuli, just as is the case with the 5 senses that we're more familiar with. The sense of smell depends on something that is giving off a smell. And similarly then with our thoughts and our imaginations and so on. The mind, as a sensing instrument, is dependent on other things coming to it. We'll be digging more deeply into the implications of all that as we go. For now, it leads me to make the point that when the Buddha speaks of attachment to sense pleasures, he means all of that, including attachment to our various mental constructs, and especially the ones we like, the ideas and assumptions about everything that cause us to feel agreement or joy or pleasure of some kind. And on one hand, we can get attached to the ways that those senses, including the mind, give us that pleasure and happiness. That's the attachment that's most common among us. But remember, the Buddha is addressing monks most directly in his teaching, those who've already left behind the pursuit of all of that. And to them, he points out another type of clinging, a different kind of addiction, the eradication of all pleasure and happiness based in the senses through practices of extreme austerity. The Buddha is touching here on what I would call religious addictions. The Buddha was very aware of the human tendency to addiction, clinging, attachment, in all sorts of forms, even addiction to practices we think might end the addictions. Every other spiritual teacher of the time, including those whom the Buddha himself had tried to learn from, was offering their own set of practices aimed at the cessation of the senses. For the Buddha to say, in effect, that too won't work, was a claim that flew in the face of all those widely held assumptions. This reveals something about the Buddha's entire approach. He evaluated everything on a very practical basis. Is it beneficial? In other words, does it work? Meaning, will it get me to the goal that I'm seeking? And that brings me to the next portion of the sutta. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. 2 words in that portion need some explanation. Let me start with that last one, nibbana, or nirvana in Sanskrit. This is the Buddha's goal. I said up above that we needed to look at what the aim of all this was. This is the Buddha's goal. His criteria for every practice and every concept became, will this get me to that destination? As we'll see, what the Buddha was pursuing was not so much the cessation of pleasure, not as an end in and of itself, but the cessation of suffering that arises due to the craving, greed, bitterness, anger, patterns of delusion, which leaves us in an endless cycle of beginning and ending and beginning again, as if we're stuck in a repeating loop. Nibbana, or nirvana, is a state of supreme peace, perfect freedom, unbound and unfettered by conditional truths, unbound and unfettered by that repeating cycle, knowing unconditioned reality directly, free from suffering, free from the loop. Now that's a lot, and everything in that description begs a lot of other questions because every word is like a door in a hallway, and behind each door there's an entire room full of furniture, more words, more meaning, more context. So I'm going to leave it there for now as a summary of the things we're going to be unpacking later, the rooms we will go into and the furniture we will examine as we continue with the sutta. But the other word that needs explanation in the portion I just read is this word tathagata. The term means either thus gone or thus come. Gone in this way or come in this way. It's the way the Buddha referred to himself. Blessed One is the way he was often referred to in third person by others. This is how he often referred to himself, Tathagata. It can mean both someone who has arrived at and also someone who has departed from the truth. And in many ways, Buddha is saying both to be true of himself, for he has in fact departed from the truths others assume, but which are in fact illusions. And he is claiming to have arrived at the truth of things as they really are, because he is, he claims, awakened. Which brings us again to the question of the middle way. That path is much more than just the balance between two extremes. It's actually this entire approach to life. It is the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Now, I've spent this whole episode setting the stage for those things. It feels anticlimactic here, but I'm going to have to wait and begin to take those up in the next episode. There's just too much to say about each of the four and each of the eight to get started now. So, I'm going to start winding up. But before signing off, it seems fitting to pause and allow the Buddha's insights to become a sort of invitation to us also to go forth and be willing to allow our own ways of thinking and our own assumptions to be challenged, to face the fact that we all have addictive attachments, not necessarily to chemicals or addictions as we normally think of the word, but to patterns of life that just don't work, that don't deliver what we really seek if we're honest with ourselves. It is then an invitation to be honest with ourselves first and foremost. That's one of the gifts, actually, that my friendship with the Buddha has brought to me. A different level, a different layer, a different dimension of self-awareness. The more I learn about the layers and nuances woven throughout the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, the more I become aware of my own addictive attachments to ways I think and live and ways I see myself and my quote-unquote self. Those are all just some of the things that the Buddha means by the awakening and enlightenment to which we are invited. So it's an invitation to you and I, an invitation asking us to join together in saying yes to the invitation to go forth. And we will be pursuing that invitation more fully next time.